The morning of March 27th, 1945, 4:50 a.m., Captain Abraham Baum's Sherman tank lurches to a stop as machine gun fire rips through the darkness ahead. The 24-year-old captain from the Bronx is 60 miles behind German lines with 307 American soldiers, and they've just driven straight into hell. Enemy tracers slice through the pre-dawn blackness like angry hornets. German voices shout commands from invisible positions. Baum's task force, 16 tanks, 27 half-tracks, 3 self-propelled guns, and 7 jeeps, is trapped on a narrow road outside the town of Gemünden, surrounded by an enemy they can't see. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not this quickly, not this decisively. 24 hours earlier, Baum had been standing in front of General George S. Patton himself, receiving orders for what would become one of the most controversial missions of World War II. A mission that would cost nearly every man in Task Force Baum their life or freedom. A mission that many historians believe was ordered not for strategic military purposes, but for one man's personal agenda. The story of Task Force Baum begins not with Captain Baum, but with a telegram that arrived at General Patton's headquarters on March 23, 1945. The message informed Patton that his son-in-law, Lieutenant Colonel John K. Waters, was being held at a German prisoner of war camp called Oflag XIII-B, near a small Bavarian town called Hammelburg. Waters had been captured in Tunisia back in February 1943 during the disastrous American defeat at Kasserine Pass. For over 2 years, Patton's daughter Beatrice had waited for news of her husband. Now, Patton knew exactly where Waters was, and he was going to do something about it. The problem was that Hammelburg lay 60 miles behind enemy lines. 60 miles through hostile German territory, crawling with Wehrmacht units, Waffen SS troops, and increasingly desperate defenders of the Third Reich. The German military might have been in retreat, but they were far from beaten. They still had teeth, sharp ones. If you're enjoying this story of courage and controversy from World War II, hit that like button and subscribe to the Old Breed channel for more untold military history delivered every week. On the evening of March 25th, Patton summoned Major General Manton Eddy, commander of the 12th Corps. Patton wanted a raid, a lightning strike deep into German territory to liberate the POW camp at Hammelburg. Eddy was horrified. He argued that such a raid would require at least an entire armored combat command, 3,500 men minimum. Anything less would be suicide. Patton disagreed. He wanted a small force, fast, mobile, in and out before the Germans knew what hit them. When Eddy continued to protest, Patton overruled him and went directly to Brigadier General William Hogue, commander of the 4th Armored Division. Hogue wasn't happy either, but when George Patton gave an order, you followed it. The task fell to Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Yes, the same Abrams who would later have America's main battle tank named after him. Abrams commanded the 37th Tank Battalion, and he selected Captain Abraham Baum to lead the mission. Baum was tough, smart, and aggressive. He'd already won the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star. If anyone could pull off this impossible mission, it was Abe Baum. But even Baum was stunned when he learned the details. 300 men to penetrate 60 miles behind enemy lines, to attack a POW camp guarded by who knew how many Germans, and then somehow make it back with hundreds of liberated prisoners? The math didn't add up. Patton personally briefed Baum on March 25th. The general was animated, excited even. He told Baum that intelligence indicated only light resistance along the route. He promised that fighter-bomber support would be available. He assured the young captain that the element of surprise would carry the day. What Patton didn't tell Baum was that his son-in-law was in that camp. He didn't mention that this entire operation might be motivated by personal rather than strategic considerations. He simply ordered Baum to liberate the camp and bring back the American prisoners. Patton did, however, do something unusual. He assigned his own aide, Major Alexander Stiller, to accompany the mission. Stiller's official role was to assist with identification of American prisoners. In reality, Stiller knew exactly what John Waters looked like. His real job was to make sure Patton's son-in-law made it out alive. Task Force Baum assembled quickly. From the 37th Tank Battalion came Company C's 10 medium Sherman tanks and 6 light tanks. From the 10th Armored Infantry Battalion came Company A, about 90 infantrymen riding in half-tracks. The 89th Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron contributed assault guns and jeeps. In total, 307 men and 53 vehicles. They would carry extra fuel in 5-gallon cans strapped to their vehicles, but even that would barely be enough for a 120-mile round trip. The force departed at 9 p.m. on March 26th. The night was dark, overcast, perfect for concealment. They rolled east through American lines and into the unknown. At first, things went well. The column moved rapidly through the darkness, encountering only scattered resistance. They blew through the town of Schweinfurt, catching German defenders completely by surprise. Enemy vehicles were destroyed before their crews knew what was happening. The element of surprise was working, but surprise only lasts so long, and Task Force Baum was leaving a trail of destruction that couldn't be ignored. By 3 a.m. on March 27th, German commanders throughout the region were receiving frantic reports of an American armored column rampaging through their rear areas. Field telephones rang. Radio messages crackled through the night. The Wehrmacht's efficient communication system began to mobilize a response. The first serious resistance came at Gmunden, where our story began. As Baum's lead tanks approached a bridge over the main river, German defenders opened fire with everything they had: machine guns, anti-tank guns, Panzerfausts, the deadly German rocket-propelled anti-tank weapon. The narrow streets of Gmunden became a death trap. Baum ordered his tanks to return fire. Sherman 75mm guns roared in the darkness. Buildings exploded. German positions were silenced one by one, but the clock was ticking. Every minute of delay gave the Germans more time to organize. The task force fought through Gmunden, losing 3 half-tracks and taking several casualties. They pressed on, but now the Germans knew exactly where they were and where they were heading. All along their route, German units were moving into blocking positions. At the town of Bergsinn, Task Force Baum ran into elements of an SS unit. These weren't rear-area troops or old men from the Volkssturm militia. These were hardcore Nazi fighters. The battle was fierce, but brief. Baum's tanks blasted through, but they lost another half-track and more men. By now, German fighters should have been strafing the column. German artillery should have been raining down. But something strange was happening. The German response seemed confused, disorganized. Unknown to Baum, many German commanders simply couldn't believe the reports they were receiving. A single American column 60 miles behind the lines? It had to be a mistake. Maybe it was the vanguard of a major offensive? Some German units actually retreated, thinking they were about to be overrun by Patton's entire Third Army. This confusion saved Task Force Baum. For now. As dawn broke on March 27th, the exhausted Americans could see their objective in the distance. Oflag XIII-B sat on a hill overlooking the town of Hammelburg. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. Inside were approximately 1,500 American officers, including Lieutenant Colonel John Waters. But between Task Force Baum and the camp lay the town of Hammelburg itself, and Hammelburg was ready. The Germans had positioned anti-tank guns covering the approaches. Infantry with Panzerfausts hid in buildings. As Baum's lead tanks entered the town, all hell broke loose again. Sherman tanks dueled with German anti-tank guns at point-blank range. American infantry dismounted from their half-tracks and fought house to house, the streets filled with smoke and flames. Captain Baum made a crucial decision. He split his force. One group would continue fighting through Hammelburg to keep the Germans busy. The other, including Baum himself, would circle around the town and attack the camp directly. It was a risky move that divided his already small force, but Baum saw no alternative. The assault on the camp began at 3 p.m. Baum's tanks crashed through the barbed wire fences as American prisoners cheered wildly. Guard towers were destroyed by tank fire. German guards fled or surrendered. Within minutes, the camp was liberated. Inside the camp, pandemonium reigned. 1,500 American officers, some of whom had been prisoners for over 2 years, were suddenly free. They mobbed their liberators, desperate for news from home. But Captain Baum had no time for reunions. He needed to find the senior American officer and organize an evacuation immediately. That senior officer was Colonel Paul Good. When Baum explained that he had only 300 men and needed to evacuate 1,500 prisoners, Good was speechless. It was impossible. Most of the prisoners were in no condition for a 60-mile forced march through enemy territory. Many were sick or wounded. They had no weapons, no equipment, no training for this kind of operation. Meanwhile, Major Stiller was searching frantically for John Waters. He found him and delivered Patton's message. Essentially, "Your father-in-law has come to get you out." Waters was stunned. He quickly realized the implications. This entire mission, these men dying outside, it was all because of him, because of who he was married to. Waters did something remarkable. He refused special treatment. He told Stiller he would take his chances with the other prisoners. He wouldn't abandon his fellow officers. But fate had other plans. Waters volunteered to approach the German forces in Hammelburg under a white flag to arrange a ceasefire, hoping to prevent further bloodshed. As he walked toward German lines with a white flag and several other officers, a German soldier suddenly opened fire. Waters was shot through the hip, the bullet tearing through his body and exiting near his spine. He collapsed, critically wounded. Back at the camp, Baum faced an impossible decision. He had perhaps 200 vehicles still operational. He had 1,500 prisoners wanting evacuation. The math was brutal and simple. He could take maybe 250 prisoners at most. The rest would have to be left behind. Some prisoners decided to strike out on their own, disappearing into the countryside in small groups. Others, too weak or sick to travel, stayed in the camp. About 250 climbed aboard Baum's vehicles or prepared to march alongside them. As Task Force Baum prepared to depart, German forces were closing in from all directions. The German 7th Army had finally understood what was happening. This wasn't the spearhead of a major offensive. This was a raid, and the raiders were now trapped. Wehrmacht units, SS troops, even training battalions from nearby military schools were converging on Hammelburg. The journey back began at 9 p.m. on March 27th. Baum led his battered column west, trying to return the way they had come. But the roads were now blocked. German forces had seized key crossroads and bridges. The task force was forced to detour, burning precious fuel. Near the village of Hallrich, disaster struck. German tanks and infantry were waiting in ambush. In the darkness, Task Force Baum drove straight into the trap. The fight was savage and confused. Tanks fired at point-blank range. Infantry fought with rifles and grenades. Vehicles burned like torches in the night. Baum ordered his force to break up into small groups and try to escape independently. But it was too late. They were surrounded. As dawn broke on March 28th, the remnants of Task Force Baum made their last stand on a hill called Reussenberg. They fought magnificently, outnumbered, outgunned, exhausted, and nearly out of ammunition. They held off repeated German attacks. But the outcome was never in doubt. One by one, the American vehicles were destroyed. One by one, the defenders fell. Captain Abraham Baum was wounded by shrapnel but continued fighting. When his last tank was destroyed, he ordered the survivors to scatter and try to escape on foot. Of the 307 men who had started the mission, only 35 made it back to American lines. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. Baum himself was taken prisoner. So was Major Stiller. So were almost all the prisoners they had tried to rescue. The mission had failed completely. John Waters survived his wound, but remained a prisoner until the camp was liberated by regular American forces 2 weeks later. The man whose rescue had prompted the entire operation never left German captivity because of Task Force Baum. When news of the disaster reached Patton, the general was reportedly devastated. But publicly, he maintained that the raid had been a legitimate military operation designed to liberate American prisoners and disrupt German rear areas. He claimed he hadn't known Waters was in the camp, a claim contradicted by multiple witnesses and documents. The controversy began almost immediately. Why had Patton sent such a small force on such a dangerous mission? Why had he overruled his subordinate commanders who warned it was suicide? Why had his own aide accompanied the mission? Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams was furious. He had lost 60 good men and 16 tanks for nothing. General Manton Eddy considered filing court-martial charges against Patton, but was talked out of it. The war was almost over. Why create a scandal? But the families of the dead and captured deserved answers, and slowly the truth emerged. Patton had known his son-in-law was in that camp. He had ordered the mission specifically to rescue him. He had sacrificed 300 men for personal reasons. Patton's defenders argue that the general genuinely believed the mission could succeed. They point out that Patton had always been aggressive, always willing to take risks. They note that he was deeply affected by the loss of Task Force Baum and that he had not intended for those men to die. Critics contend that Patton abused his command authority for personal gain. They argue that he recklessly endangered soldiers' lives for a family member. They maintain that this was Patton at his worst, arrogant, impulsive, and willing to spend other men's blood for his own purposes. Captain Abraham Baum, who spent the rest of the war in a German POW camp, later offered his own perspective. He said he believed Patton genuinely thought the mission could succeed, but he also acknowledged that if he had known Waters was the real objective, he would have understood why they were taking such incredible risks with such a small force. The statistics tell their own grim story. Of 307 men in Task Force Baum, 32 were killed in action. The rest were wounded or captured. Of the approximately 250 prisoners who attempted to escape with the task force, most were recaptured. The mission liberated no one. It achieved nothing except to demonstrate the terrible cost of mixing personal emotions with military command. Yet there's another dimension to this story that deserves consideration. The men of Task Force Baum fought with extraordinary courage against overwhelming odds. They penetrated deeper behind enemy lines than any comparable American force during the war in Europe. They destroyed significant German equipment and troops. They created chaos and confusion that tied down German units for crucial days. Men like Private First Class Robert Vanette, who single-handedly destroyed 2 German tanks with a bazooka before being killed. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant Charles Graham, who fought his Sherman until it was burning around him. Medic Technician 5th Grade Robert Weitzel, who repeatedly exposed himself to enemy fire to treat wounded soldiers. These men didn't know about Waters. They didn't know about Patton's personal motivations. They simply did their duty as American soldiers, following orders and protecting their brothers in arms. Their courage deserves to be remembered, even if the mission they died for was fundamentally flawed. The Hammelburg Raid also raises profound questions about military leadership and ethics. When is a risk acceptable? How many lives is it worth to rescue prisoners of war? What happens when personal feelings cloud command judgment? These aren't easy questions. War rarely offers clear moral choices. But the story of Task Force Baum suggests that when leaders allow personal considerations to override military judgment, the cost is always paid in blood. Young men die, families grieve, and the trust between soldiers and commanders, essential to any military organization, is damaged. In the decades since World War II, the Hammelburg Raid has been studied in military academies as a cautionary tale. It demonstrates the importance of clear objectives, adequate resources, and, most importantly, the moral responsibility commanders bear for their soldiers' lives. Patton himself seemed to understand this, at least in his darker moments. Years later, his widow Beatrice revealed that the failure of Task Force Baum haunted him. He knew he had crossed a line. He knew those men had died because of his personal decision. Yet Patton was also a product of his time and his personality. He was a warrior who believed in aggressive action. He was a commander who often achieved the impossible through sheer audacity. The same qualities that made him one of America's greatest combat generals also led him to order the Hammelburg Raid. Perhaps the last word should go to Captain Abraham Baum, the man who led the doomed mission. Years after the war, when asked if he was bitter about being sent on a suicide mission, Baum replied that he was proud of what his men had accomplished under impossible circumstances. They had done their duty. They had fought with honor. That, in the end, was what mattered. The story of Task Force Baum reminds us that war is not just about strategy and tactics. It's about human beings making life-and-death decisions under extreme pressure. Sometimes those decisions are heroic, sometimes they're tragic. Often, they're both. As we remember the 307 men of Task Force Baum, we should honor their courage while learning from the circumstances that led to their sacrifice. They deserved better than to be pawns in a personal mission. But they fought and died as warriors, and that sacrifice should never be forgotten. Did you know that some German commanders initially refused to believe the reports about Task Force Baum, thinking it impossible that Americans would send such a small force so deep behind enemy lines? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if this story of courage and controversy moved you, please share it with someone who appreciates military history. Don't forget to subscribe to the Old Breed channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss our next deep dive into the untold stories of military history. These are the stories that shaped our world, stories of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances making decisions that echo through history. Until next time, this is the Old Breed, keeping their memory alive.